40,000 years ago, you would not have been alone. Share the planet with a different kind of human. Shorter, stockier, with a brow ridge heavier than yours, but smart enough to bury their dead, make tools, maybe even speak. Then, in what amounts to a blink of evolutionary time, they were gone. Not just them. At least 4 other human species vanished. Within the same rough window, different continents, different bodies, different survival strategies that had worked for hundreds of thousands of years. All of them disappeared right around the time one particular species started spreading fast. Us. For most of the 20th century, the story of human evolution got taught as a straight line. One species slowly turning into the next, generation after generation, climbing steadily toward us like rungs on a ladder. That image is everywhere, printed in textbooks, stamped onto posters. A hunched ape gradually straightening into a modern human walking triumphantly off. The right edge of the page. It's clean, it's satisfying. It's also almost entirely wrong. That specific image, often called the March of Progress, originated as an illustration in a 1965 book, never intended as a literal scientific model of how evolution actually works. It was meant to show a rough sequence of fossil discoveries lined up by approximate age, nothing more. But the image proved so visually compelling that it escaped its original context almost immediately, reproduced, parodied, and absorbed into popular culture so thoroughly that it quietly became the default mental model most people still carry today, even though working paleoanthropologists abandoned that simple linear framework decades ago. The real picture, pieced together slowly through fossils and, more recently, ancient DNA, looks nothing like a ladder. It looks more like a crowded family reunion. For most of the last 2 million years, multiple human species existed on Earth at the same time, sometimes several at once, spread across different continents, occasionally overlapping in the same regions entirely. The turning point in understanding this came from technology, not new fossils. In 2010, researchers successfully sequenced a complete Neanderthal genome, extracted from bone fragments tens of thousands of years old. That same year, a tiny finger bone found in a Siberian cave, called Denisova, yielded DNA belonging to an entirely unknown human species, one science hadn't even known to look for. The scale of that achievement is easy to understate. DNA degrades over time, breaking into smaller and smaller fragments, contaminated by bacteria, fungi, and the DNA of everyone who has ever touched the specimen since. It was excavated, reconstructing a usable genome from material that old required not just new sequencing technology, but entirely new statistical methods for separating genuine ancient DNA from the overwhelming noise surrounding it. It took years of methodological development before the technique became reliable enough to trust. Once it did, the pace of discovery accelerated dramatically. Within a decade, researchers had usable genetic material from multiple Neanderthal individuals. Across different regions and time periods, Denisovan remains from multiple sites, and increasingly detailed maps of exactly how these populations related to each other and to us. Suddenly, the question shifted. It was no longer just about when different human species lived. It became about what actually happened when their timelines started running out, one after another, all pointing toward roughly the same narrow window. Answering that question properly required combining several different kinds of evidence that had previously been studied, almost entirely in isolation from one another: fossil anatomy, archaeological artifacts, climate records, and now genetics, each field historically operating with its own specialists, its own conferences, its own assumptions. Only once researchers began deliberately combining all 4 did the overlapping pattern across these separate extinctions become genuinely visible, rather than sitting scattered across disconnected corners of different academic disciplines. The list, once you actually lay it out, is longer than most people expect, and stranger too. Homo erectus, one of the most successful and long-lived human species ever to exist, survived for well over 1 million years across Africa and Asia. The last confirmed population, found on the Indonesian island of Java, appears to have persisted until roughly 110,000 years ago, an almost unimaginable run, finally coming to an end. On the nearby island of Flores, a strikingly small human species, standing barely over 1 meter tall and nicknamed the Hobbit by the researchers who discovered it, seems to have survived in isolation until somewhere around 50,000 years ago, overlapping at least in theory with early modern humans moving through the same region. Their small stature likely resulted from a well-documented evolutionary pattern called island dwarfism, in which large-bodied species isolated on small islands. With limited resources and few predators tend to shrink over successive generations, since a smaller body requires less food to sustain. Elephants on the same island underwent a similar transformation, evolving into a dwarf species alongside the small human population, sharing their habitat. It's a striking reminder that human evolution, like the evolution of any other species, remained fully subject to the same environmental pressures shaping every other form of life around it right up until the very end of that particular lineage. Neanderthals, the most extensively studied of all, the vanished human species, thrived across Europe and parts of Western Asia. For several 100,000 years, adapted specifically to cold climates and large game hunting. Their last confirmed populations disappear from the fossil and archaeological record. Somewhere between 40 and 39,000 years ago, the Denisovans remain the most mysterious of the group, known almost entirely through DNA rather than substantial fossil remains. Genetic evidence suggests they persisted in parts of Asia, until at least somewhere around 40,000 years ago as well, vanishing in the same rough era as their Neanderthal cousins. On a completely different part of the map, there's at least one more entry worth mentioning, and it complicates the timeline even further. In a cave system in South Africa, researchers discovered the remains of a previously unknown species called Homo naledi, a human relative with a puzzling mix of primitive and advanced features. Dating on these remains suggests they may have still been alive as recently as roughly 250,000 years ago, potentially overlapping with early modern humans on the African continent itself, far earlier than any of the other disappearances. And in a location that raises entirely separate questions researchers are still working through. Line these dates up next to each other, and a pattern becomes hard to ignore. Species that had each independently survived for tens or hundreds of thousands of years on different continents, adapted to completely different environments, all cluster their disappearance within roughly the same rough window, most of them collapsing within about 20,000 years of each other, a narrow sliver of time compared to how long each species had already persisted. By now, picture that figure from the beginning again, standing at a distance in the fading light. Whatever exactly happened to end that lineage, it wasn't a single dramatic event. It was the final chapter of something that had already been unfolding for generations before anyone alive at the time could have recognized it happening at all. So what actually links all of these separate disappearances together? For a long time, the leading explanation was simple, and frankly a little uncomfortable. Modern humans arrived, competed directly for the same limited resources, and won through superior tools, better organization, or sheer numbers, gradually pushing older species toward extinction the way an invasive species might outcompete a native one. There's real evidence supporting parts of this. Modern humans expanding out of Africa did arrive in regions immediately before or during the final disappearance of local species in several documented cases, a timing correlation that's hard to dismiss as pure coincidence. So was it really that simple, one species just being better equipped than the others? The advantages modern humans may have carried into these encounters were often subtle rather than overwhelming. Some researchers point to more complex social networks, evidence suggesting modern human groups maintained wider trade and contact links across greater distances, potentially allowing knowledge, tools, and genetic diversity to spread more efficiently across a larger, more interconnected population. Others point to differences in hunting strategy and diet breadth, with modern human sites showing evidence of a wider range of food sources being exploited compared to some Neanderthal sites, a flexibility that may have mattered enormously during periods of environmental instability. None of these individual advantages look dramatic in isolation, but small, compounding advantages, repeated across thousands of generations and countless local interactions, can produce enormous outcomes over enough time, even without a single decisive confrontation ever taking place. A slightly wider trade network here, a slightly more varied diet there, repeated across 10,000 generations, adds up to something that looks, in hindsight, almost inevitable, even though nothing about it would have felt inevitable to anyone actually living through it at the time. But genetic evidence has complicated that simple story considerably in a direction most people don't expect. Most people whose ancestry traces outside sub-Saharan Africa carry somewhere between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA in their genome today. In parts of Melanesia, that figure climbs even higher for Denisovan ancestry, reaching 4 to 6% in some populations. That's not the genetic signature of a species that got wiped out in open conflict. That's the genetic signature of a species that got, at least partially, absorbed. Interbreeding appears to have happened repeatedly across multiple regions, over an extended period, not as a rare accident, but as a regular feature of contact between these different human populations, which raises an uncomfortable possibility sitting right alongside the competition theory. Some of these species may not have simply died out. They may have been genetically diluted into a growing modern human population, generation after generation, until there were no individuals left who could be classified as fully belonging to the older lineage at all. It's worth pausing on how counterintuitive that actually is, compared to how extinction usually gets imagined. A species doesn't need every individual to die for its distinct identity to disappear. It only needs enough interbreeding, sustained over enough generations, for the specific combination of traits that once defined it to gradually dissolve into a larger, more genetically diverse population, even while some of its individual genetic contributions continue on indefinitely inside that larger group. Population size likely made this dilution even faster than it might otherwise have been. Genetic analysis of Neanderthal remains suggests their overall population, even at its healthiest, was almost certainly quite small, likely numbering in the tens of thousands scattered across an entire continent, rather than the hundreds of thousands or millions a species needs to remain genetically robust over the long run. A small population is fragile. In a specific way, it has less genetic diversity to weather disease, less resilience to environmental shocks, and far more vulnerability to simply being outnumbered and absorbed once a much larger population moves into the same territory. Genome analysis has actually revealed direct evidence of this fragility inside Neanderthal DNA itself. Several sequenced Neanderthal genomes show signs consistent with inbreeding, harmful genetic mutations accumulating at rates typically seen in small, isolated populations with limited options for finding unrelated mates. One particularly striking genome, sequenced from remains found in Siberia, suggested parents who were closely related, possibly half-siblings, a pattern that becomes considerably more common when a population has shrunk small enough that genuinely unrelated partners simply become difficult to find within reasonable traveling distance. Climate almost certainly played a role too, layered on top of everything else. The period surrounding many of these disappearances coincided with significant climate instability, sudden temperature swings that would have stressed food supplies and habitat, availability for species already surviving in relatively small, specialized populations, adapted closely to specific environmental conditions that were actively shifting beneath them. Disease may have compounded the problem further still. When two populations that have been genetically separated for hundreds of thousands of years come into regular contact, each typically carries pathogens the other has never encountered, and therefore has no accumulated immunity against. This exact dynamic devastated indigenous populations in the Americas following European contact thousands of years later, and researchers studying the earlier disappearance of Neanderthals and other archaic humans have proposed something structurally similar may have been at play, an invisible factor that leaves essentially no direct archaeological trace, but could have quietly weakened already fragile, small populations well before any other pressure finished the job. There's also direct archaeological evidence of actual encounters between these different populations, beyond what genetics alone can tell us. At a small number of sites, researchers have found modern human and Neanderthal remains dated closely enough in time and geography to suggest genuine overlap and contact, sometimes within just a few generations of each other, in the same regional area. These aren't imagined meetings reconstructed purely from statistics. They're physical evidence that these populations genuinely crossed paths, repeatedly, across a wide enough span of time and geography for exactly the kind of interbreeding the genetic record shows actually happened. Here's the part of this story that quietly reframes everything that came before it. We tend to think about extinction as a clean, binary event. A species exists, and then, at some identifiable point, it doesn't. One day there are Neanderthals. The next, conceptually speaking, there simply aren't. But what the genetic evidence increasingly suggests is something considerably blurrier and honestly more interesting than a simple ending. If a meaningful percentage of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA survives inside the genomes of billions of people alive today, in what precise sense did those species actually disappear? Their bodies stopped existing as distinct, recognizable forms. Certainly, their specific combination of traits stopped being passed down as a coherent, separate lineage, but fragments of their genetic code, the literal biological information that made them who they were, didn't vanish at all. It simply stopped being organized into a separate species and started being carried forward, diluted but present, inside ours. This isn't just a comforting reframe layered on top of the science after the fact either. It reflects a genuinely difficult question biologists still argue over about what a species boundary even means when two populations remain similar enough to produce fertile offspring together. The traditional definition of a species often hinges on reproductive isolation, groups that can't successfully interbreed with each other. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans clearly don't fit that definition cleanly at all, which is exactly why some researchers now prefer to think of them less as fully separate species and more as distinct populations of a single, sprawling, more variable human lineage that spent a very long stretch of time developing apart before partially converging again. Some researchers studying this have started describing it less as extinction in the traditional sense and more as a kind of absorption or genetic merger, playing out slowly across thousands of years and countless individual encounters between two populations who likely didn't think of themselves as separate species in any formal sense at all, just as different-looking neighbors, occasionally forming families together. That framing extends further than most people initially assume, too. Modern humans, it turns out, aren't a single, uniform lineage that simply absorbed a few outside contributions along the edges. Different modern human populations around the world carry different combinations and amounts of Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry, shaped by exactly which ancient populations their specific ancestors happened to encounter, and when, as modern humans spread gradually across the globe. In a very real sense, there is no single, pure version of modern humanity that existed independently of these other lineages. Every population alive today is already some version of a mosaic, assembled from multiple ancient sources, whether or not anyone involved ever thought about it in those terms. That reframing changes the emotional weight of the hook this video opened with, because the answer to who's responsible for their disappearance isn't simply us replacing them through violence or competition. In a very real, measurable, biological sense, it's also us, in part, because we are them, carried forward in fragments none of us chose, and most of us never think about. Some of those inherited fragments aren't just genetic trivia sitting silently in the background either. Researchers have traced specific Neanderthal-derived gene variants to concrete effects in living people today, some connected to immune system function, some linked to skin and hair characteristics well suited to lower light, colder environments, a trait that may have helped early modern humans adapt more quickly to unfamiliar climates as they spread beyond Africa. In effect, interbreeding with an already well-adapted local population may have handed incoming modern humans a genetic shortcut, skipping tens of thousands of years of independent adaptation to conditions Neanderthals had already spent hundreds of millennia adjusting to. There's an uncomfortable flip side to this story as well, one that complicates any tidy narrative about a peaceful genetic merger. Some Neanderthal-derived genetic variants found in modern populations are associated today with increased risk for certain health conditions, including some immune and metabolic disorders. The exchange, in other words, wasn't uniformly beneficial. It was messy, uneven, and, like most biological inheritance, came bundled with both advantages and liabilities that nobody at the time could have possibly chosen or understood. So picture that figure from the beginning one final time, standing at a distance in the fading light. Somewhere in that moment, whether through conflict, through climate, through slow demographic decline, or through a quiet meeting between two people from very different lineages, a thread was beginning that wouldn't fully play out for tens of thousands of years. That thread runs directly into the present, sitting quietly inside an enormous number of living human genomes, inherited without ceremony, without anyone choosing it, simply passed down alongside everything else that makes a person who they are. It's worth sitting for a moment with just how strange that actually is. Somewhere, right now, a person is walking around with a specific immune response, inherited from a Denisovan ancestor who lived in a Siberian cave 40,000 years ago, entirely unaware of it, going about an ordinary day that has nothing whatsoever to do with ancient human evolution. The connection isn't symbolic or metaphorical. It's sitting quietly in their actual cells, doing actual biological work, right now in this moment. Maybe the real answer to why those other human species disappeared isn't as simple as one version replacing another. Maybe it's closer to the truth to say that several different versions of what it means to be human quietly folded into one over thousands of years, until the distinction itself stopped meaning very much at all. None of this erases the real losses involved. Entire distinct ways of surviving, entire bodies of knowledge specifically adapted to environments modern humans hadn't yet mastered, entire lineages with their own history stretching back hundreds of Thousands of years genuinely ended. That part of the story is real and worth taking seriously rather than smoothing over entirely with a comforting genetic footnote. The Neanderthals standing in that fading light 40,000 years ago didn't simply vanish in the way a species is usually imagined to vanish. Fragments of that same genetic story are still here, right now, carried forward in people who have never heard the word Neanderthal, in places that species never even knew existed. Not gone exactly, just folded into what came next.